codling moth. We're going to talk for 30 minutes on one pest. But if you really want to dive into the management of codling moth and really understand it, there's actually a lot to cover. So Jared mentioned IPM, and that's what I do. So I always have to give a definition. If you're not familiar with it, it's the sustainable approach to managing pests by using a lot of different varieties and tools that help to minimize risks to our human health and the environment and economic health too, if you're wanting to make some money. So a general IPM program may contain 6 steps: knowing the pest, how to monitor the pest, making a decision on whether to treat, preventing with some non-chemical options, and then choosing the best pesticide if you need to take that route, and then analyzing your results. And an IPM program would be used on any type of farm, whether it's organic, permaculture, sustainable, or just conventional. So it's across the board. So I'm going to use IPM tools or techniques when I talk about codling moth. All right. So codling moth is the primary pest of apple and pear. And we probably think of it as the worm in the apples. And actually that worm or the caterpillar is looking for the seeds. So they're tunneling in straight to the core. They're not meandering around throughout the flesh of the apple. And if it's not treated, in Idaho and I'm in Utah, the pests can sometimes attack 100% of the fruits on a tree. So it's definitely one, if you want to grow nice, healthy crops, you need to manage. So here's actually, these 2 pictures were both taken from farms where they did manage for codling moth. So there can be these failures where you can see on the outside of the fruit, on every single fruit in the picture on the left, there's codling moth damage, and that material on the outside of the fruit is called frass, and that's the insect poop. And the picture on the right, every single fruit is damaged as well, and the codling moth has entered through the underside of the fruit. So codling moths go through what's called complete metamorphosis. So that means that the larvae or the young look completely different from the adults, and only the adults have wings. And the larval stage, or the caterpillars shown on the right, when they first hatch, of course, they're very tiny, and they go through a lot of different stages till they become a mature caterpillar. And each stage is called an instar, and it's just a next growth stage. So for the life cycle of codling moth, all right, they spend the winter actually as a caterpillar or a larva, and they're in protected areas. It could be on the tree itself, it could be on the ground, or some other place around the area of the trees you're growing. And in spring, around this time of year, they're starting to pupate, meaning they're turning into a moth. And they emerge as moths when your apple trees are in full bloom. So that's a general timing of when these moths start flying. And then, of course, they mate and they lay eggs. And the eggs can be laid on the fruit or on the leaves. And the larvae hatch, and they look for those fruit, and they tunnel in for the seeds. And then they will grow bigger and bigger, bigger inside the fruit. And once they become a mature size, about an inch or so, then they'll exit the fruit and look for a place to pupate. And this cycle will repeat itself in Idaho about 2 times per year, but it could be as many as 3 times per year if we have a very long, warm summer. But if that larva is at the end of the summer, it will instead look for a place to spend the winter. And the cycle repeats again the following year. So I mentioned, there's these multiple generations, meaning egg to adult is 1 generation. So another way we can look at that is just this graphical representation. So what these lines are is moths that fly in the first generation, so spring to early summer. So when 100% of moths have emerged and laid their eggs, that's the end of that generation. And then there's a little bit of a break, and then another set of moths will emerge and lay eggs. So that's the flight of the moths. But then there's, of course, the eggs that they hatch coincides with that moth flight generation. And it's off by about a couple of weeks because, of course, the eggs need time to incubate and then hatch. So that timing is shifted a little bit. All right, so now I'm going to talk about management, and I'm going to, again, use it in this IPM context. But before I go to number 2, monitoring, I'm going to skip to number 4 and talk about using non-chemical options. Okay, so when I'm out looking for codling moth damage, this picture on the lower left, where I'm looking mostly is where 2 fruits are touching. And if you think about, why would that be an area where the larvae would go into the fruit? Well, it's a protected site. They're not being exposed to predators. But also, if you're spraying the tree, the spray is less likely to cover that area where the fruits are touching. So that's a prime area for injury. So to prevent that, you could thin your fruits to 1 fruit per cluster. So it's a more laborious task, and you do need to thin anyway. But if you have 1 fruit per cluster, you lessen that chance of the fruits touching. And the other thing is that the fruits will drop from the tree, especially after damage from the first generation of eggs. So if you look at that graph below, remember that the 2 generations. So that first generation fruit that becomes damaged will drop, and there could be a larva inside those fruits. So if you can rake those up, you can mow over them, feed them to your animals, but try and get rid of that fruit, especially from the first generation, but throughout the season as it drops. And then if I know you guys are all watching this, so you're really interested in managing your apple and pear trees, but if maybe you have some crabapple trees that have larger crab apples and you don't do anything about them, those trees are promoting an increase in the population of codling moths because they'll attack the crab apples too. So remove any of those unmanaged trees, or maybe you could talk to your neighbors if they're not managing their trees, then that will really also go a long way to helping everybody. Another tool is a little more maybe time consuming, but you could think about this, and that is to use corrugated cardboard. So this cardboard that has these ridges in it, and apply it to the trunk of the tree, like with staples, or wrap it with tape, as a place where you can allow the codling moth larvae, when they leave the fruit, a hiding place to pupate. So they're always looking for these nice hiding places. But again, think about our timing. There's 2 generations. So you would want to apply it for the first generation and then remove it. So you're catching all those larvae. So that's around late June application, and then removing it in mid-July. But then there's that second generation. So you wait a few weeks and then put it on again in August, and remove it towards the middle or the end of August. So that's not a cure-all, but just another way to try and reduce the population. In fact, there was a guy who had an orchard in Idaho. I don't remember what his name was, but he told me he was doing this technique with strips of carpet, and he just felt that it was really helping his orchard. But to comment on here, this picture on the right is what you do not want to do. You don't want to put the corrugated cardboard on and just leave it and think, oh, I'm done. I've done my work, because you're just creating these great places for them to pupate into moths, and increasing the population rather than decreasing it. All right, so the primo activity for not having any moths or larvae in your fruit is bagging the fruit. And this is going to be your most laborious task, but you won't have any injured fruit. So this is where you would go online and kind of look for different ideas for maybe Japanese 2-ply apple bags. You could go on Amazon and get these glassine waxed paper bags. You can get, several hundred in a small packet, and tie it with a twist tie. Some people have actually had success with Ziploc bags as well. So those would all be good options. There's a lot of info online about using nylon footies or stockings, and those are actually not as effective. And the reason is because it's netted material. And if it touches the side of the fruit, the moth can land on the netting and still pierce through the netting and get to the fruit itself and lay eggs. So those are not as effective. So the timing of putting these bags on would be at thinning. And if you're not going to bag some fruit, it'd be best to remove them because they'll just get attacked by codling moth anyway. Mass trapping. So this is also not one that's going to solve your problem at all. But I did want to just provide you guys with a couple of recipes. There was a woman in Utah that called me a few years ago, and she said, you know what, I'm going to try these traps in milk jugs with apple cider vinegar and other things, and not spray at all. And I'm going to see what happens. And I think she did three traps per tree, and she caught hundreds of moths. Changed the bottles out, I think every 3 weeks or so. So hundreds of moths per bottle. And at the end of the season, she called me and said, you know what, I'm not doing this again. It was too messy, and most of the fruit were attacked by codling moth anyway. But I feel like this could be something if you did it year after year after year, and if you were a little bit more isolated. This could be a way to help reduce the population also. All right, so now we're going to go back to our IPM list, and I'm going to go up to the second step, monitoring, and talk a little bit about that. You definitely want to check your fruits throughout the summer. So especially look towards the middle or end of the first generation or of each generation to see how well did my treatment go. And if you're finding damage, then you might know what you need to change. So at the early season, most of the damage or the area where the codling moths enter the fruit that I have found is through the bottom end. So that's called the calyx end or the flower end. And sometimes it's hard to see. So both of these have codling moths in them through the calyx end, and there's that frass. Because these healthy fruits on the top right here have all the leftover flower parts and they look brown, and that can sometimes look similar to the frass of codling moth, especially if you're looking up into the sun. So you just need to look a little bit more closely at that. But I do also see codling moth entries on the side of the fruit. And again, maybe that's where two fruits are touching or there's a leaf protecting the fruit. So look, see how much damage you have early in the season, and you might need to slice the fruits open to see if there's a larva in there or not. And then at the second generation as well, look for damage. So July to late August. Again, on the picture on the far left, the entry might be at the calyx end, could be anywhere on the fruit. And on the picture on the far right, you might actually find some rot associated with that entry. And you might think, oh, there's, I have some kind of disease going on here. But no, it's the codling moth has introduced some decay bacteria or fungi. So this is just associated with the codling moth entry. So I want to talk a little bit about monitoring with the pheromone trap. And the reason is because University of Idaho Extension provides updates for you guys on when to spray. They're actually dates based on a location. And the only way they can provide that information is by putting up these pheromone traps. So I wanted to explain how they can get that information to you so nicely. And we do that in Utah as well. So we use what's called an orange plastic delta trap. And the reason that we can do this trapping is because moths communicate with each other through pheromones. And for mating, the female gives off a pheromone scent, and the male can find its way to the female to mate. So that pheromone scent has been synthesized in the lab and embedded in what's called a lure. And the lure on the blower here just looks like a rubber eraser. So the lure goes on a sticky liner. That on the right, the sticky trap slides right into the pheromone trap. And that's where we catch the moths. And I just saw this ad on Amazon the other day. It looks like it's from like the 1980s, but it's recent. And it's for a codling moth trap. And the ad said, help protect your fruit from worms by using this trap. Well, I want to say these traps are not a control method. They're only for monitoring. And so if you remember, when you think about it, what is this trap catching? It's only catching the males, okay? And the females are the ones that are laying eggs. So the females, well, they have all the power. So if you're only catching male moths, this is not a control option. So definitely ignore these ads for just using a trap. But I did want to just provide what, the costs are if you felt like, oh, I want to try this trap myself, just to see what the population of codling moths are at my house. So we hang the traps for two reasons. One is, as I mentioned, to see the population size over time. And I hang these in orchards throughout Utah, and I'll check them once a week. And in orchards where they're just doing regular management, I'll catch about 60 moths per week, which is fine. I mean, the numbers are going to be high. It's just so long as you kind of have an idea of what's there and you keep up with management. But the other reason is to determine when the moths first start to fly. And that's what helps us to provide you guys this exact date based on these different cities. So that's called a biofix. Okay, so that's when we get the moths right in the trap in spring. Okay, so why are we using this information? Well, insects develop from an egg to an adult based on the amount of heat that's available in the environment. So if it's not a lot of heat, they're going to develop very slowly. If there's a lot, they'll go from an egg to an adult very quickly. And we can measure that amount of heat through what's called degree days. So this is just a visual representation of how degree days would be calculated. So on this graph, it's that black area under the curve based on a 24-hour period with a minimum temperature and a maximum temperature. So each day, this calculation could be done. So here are some temperatures from last year with the minimum and maximum. And we can calculate the degree day value for each day, and that's these yellow numbers. But you know what? We don't really care about the daily number. What we care about is the accumulated number. So every day gets added to the next day, the next day, the next day, and so forth. Now, this is look a little busy, but I'll simplify it. So scientists have used degree days, and they have reared codling moths from egg to an adult, and also determined the degree day value as the codling moths go through their different life stages. So if we start up here at the top left, remember I mentioned that biofix is when the moths first come into the traps or first fly. So that would be this first 0. We start at 0. That's when the codling moths first emerge. And then the codling moths, this will go through an emergence of the adult flight, and then the eggs will start to hatch. So we have adult flight from 1 to 100, and egg hatch 1 here to 100 there. So that's one generation. So what we really want to know on this whole table is when are the moths or eggs hatching, and that's at 220 degree days. So that's our important date that we let you guys know about. And then we can know the date of egg hatch for the next generation and the next generation. So those are all very important dates for management. And so we don't do any of the calculations. We don't have to worry about any of that. We have a great website, and there's a lot of Idaho's weather stations on this website where Ron or anyone at University of Idaho could select the station and codling moth as a pest. Then let's assume today is May 20th. We can look at it and say, oh, okay, it looks like we're currently at 148 degree days. And if 220 was my magic number, okay, that's going to happen on May 25th. And that's when I know that this spray needs to happen at Idaho Falls Airport. So that's just a quick and dirty way that we're able to provide you with these site-specific dates for treatment. All right, so then what's the treatment going to be? So I mentioned treatment is provided by University of Idaho, and it's important that you're not just doing that one treatment. You do have to continue through each generation. And I already showed you this. We have moth flight and we have egg hatch. So for treatment, what we care about is the egg hatch timing. So Ron Patterson or University of Idaho provides this date for the first treatment. And then the egg hatch continues and continues and continues through early summer. And then there'll be a second generation. And there'll be this break between the end of egg hatch in the first generation, the end of egg hatch in the second. And within each generation, you can see the line of this is percent egg hatch may go from 20% up to 70% in a very short time period. So that's a lot of eggs hatching at once. And so at the bare minimum, you could just do 1 or 2 applications during this timing, so long as you can get those dates from University of Idaho Extension. So that would be the same in the second generation as well. So that kind of tells you when you need to be treating and why. So I'm going to start with some organic products, and I'm not going to go over all of these, but I wanted to mention a few things. So this is organic, and the effectiveness is from the bottom up. And there's a column here that says residual days. So that means this is about the interval that you would spray. If you put on this product, you'd wait 7 to 10 days and put it on again. So it gives that many days of protection. So I'm going to talk about 3 products that are on this list in a little bit more detail. So the one that was atop of the list is called azadirachtin. So it's kind of a big name, but that's the ingredient. And this is actually derived from the same tree as neem oil, but it's a lot more effective product. 7 to 10 days of protection. The issue with this, and I don't know why, but it's really not widely available for residential use. Like you can't just go to a big box store and find a product with this ingredient. I don't know why, but I did look at some options, and there's this online company, Arbico Organics. So they have an option there. And then Amazon carries this product, Eco Garden, which has all the great labeling, is labeled for organic. So that could be another option. And then this product, Azera, it might actually be available at your local farm store, so or your garden center store. So you could check on that one. And I think those would be great options for if you wanted to be organic for codling moth. Spinosad is another organic option. It is derived from naturally occurring soil bacteria. And there's a whole bunch of products that have spinosad that are readily available for backyard application. It lasts 7 to 10 days, a little bit less effective than that azadirachtin. And then finally for organic, I wanted to mention pyrethrin. So I imagine a lot of you guys are familiar with it. It only provides about 3 to 5 days of protection though. So let's say you were going to use pyrethrin for the second generation of codling moth, where the temperatures are hot, there's a lot of egg hatch, you're putting on a lot of sprays, even though you're organic. So that is something to think about. So the pyrethrin, it belongs to a large group of insecticides called pyrethroids, meaning it's a broad spectrum product. So it does kill a lot of other things besides just codling moth. So this is my last slide. It's the conventional products. So I mentioned there's this group called pyrethroids, okay? So pyrethroids on this list is the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5 products at the top. You can see the first 4 end in THRIN, THRAN. So there's that common theme. The last one, I don't know why it's named differently, but basically for backyard growers that want to apply a product that has a long residual period, like some of these up to 17 days, you're not really spraying as much at all, then you only have the 2 choices. You have pyrethroids or you have malathion, which is the bottom 2. And that malathion lasts about 5 days. So, and sometimes you can only spray it 2 times for the whole season. So it's really disappointing that there aren't as many non-organic options available that, that are safe to use as well. So with that, there's my contact info.
Marion, we had a question come in about safety for bees on some of those sprays.
Yeah.
I mentioned some of those that need to be ingested would be safer for the bees because they're not using that as a food source. Others are contact sprays, so avoiding your spray time, excluding the time that the bees are flying during the day for your spray time. So very early in the morning when it's still cool, or late evening when they're back at the hive.
Yeah, and that's key. And also be mindful if you have any blooming weeds underneath your trees. You definitely want to wait till late to spray. For the organic options, the first one, azadirachtin, is not harmful to bees, but because the bees are already adults, the azadirachtin only affects larvae. But the spinosad, the second option, is highly toxic to bees only when wet. So just a couple of things to keep in mind.